Hello, hello. Welcome to the Pure Desire Podcast on YouTube. I am your host, Trevor Windsor. This is a weekly podcast helping you take back your life from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. Sexual brokenness impacts us all, men and women who are stuck in shame and are unsure if healing is actually possible. Church leaders who want to help but don't know where to start. Parents who don't know how to help their kids develop sexual integrity. Wherever you're at, this podcast is for you. Through sharing stories of healing, interviewing addiction and betrayal experts, and normalizing the conversation on sexuality, we offer a clear plan for recovery and healing from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. You have what it takes to break free, heal your relationships, and take back your life. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us so much and really just pushes our message forward. All right, with that, let's get to this week's episode. Johnny B, welcome back to the podcast, man. Glad to have you.
Yeah, honored to be here.
One thing that we constantly emphasize at Pure Desire, we talk about it all the time, is the power of story. And I mean, I say story and it's like a trigger word of happiness for you. We know how powerful and effective sharing our story can be in our own development of our story, but then also helping others find hope, freedom, and healing. So with our time today, we're going to explore a framework that really you use, and you are on a lot of calls with donors. You're sharing your story a lot. I would almost say it's one of your spiritual gifts is sharing your story. And I share a wall with him, so I hear that gift being used often in a good way. But we want to look at that framework that you use, do it in a way too that would take, maybe hours or weeks, not years. You and I, even this morning, were talking that someone might have 70 years to span to tell that story, and you can't sit down and tell someone 70 years in an hour. And so the whole idea today is trying to look at how we relatively quickly but effectively tell our story to other people. And as I already mentioned with you in your role, you tell your story to a lot of people and you hear a lot of people's stories. What is it about our personal story that's so powerful and encouraging to other people?
This is by far one of my favorite parts of my roles. You have already mentioned that. And
as we both know,
would you repeat that again? I'm not sure we got it.
This is my favorite part of my job.
And it's good that it is, because otherwise he would hate his job.
Oh, 100%.
So true. Yeah. I say for the longest time on the top of my whiteboard, if you had come into my room, you would have saw the words that said, "Your story matters" at the very top, which the question that then begs to be asked is why? Why does your story matter? And I would say it's simply because it's God's story. It's the story of redemption that he's writing in our lives, and he loves to write stories of redemption. He loves to use the weak things to shame the strong. I love that verse in 1 Corinthians. And then he goes on to say that it's our weakness that quite literally is his power made perfect. In fact, his power rests on us in our weakness. And so regarding why is story powerful? Because our weakness, quite literally in this paradoxical way, is the very thing that is God's strength in our life. And so for me, I think it allows others to relate. It allows others to empathize with us because we're all weak. We're all broken. We're all messed up in this fallen world. And Dan Allender actually says, to be like Jesus means that we must enter the complexity of both dignity and depravity because we are made in the image of God, yes, glorious. And yet we are also have taken on Adam and Eve's hiding, which leads to ruin. And so we are glorious ruins and we are bent glory, all in the same context, which is kind of wild to me, but it was actually with working with David Robbins at Family Life. He would often say that if the goal of the Christian life is dependence, then that means that weakness is our greatest advantage. And so for me, I think when I get to connect with donors, there's something so profound about saying, here's the worst part of my story.
Yeah, seriously.
That maybe I would have never told to anybody, but that integration of our sexual brokenness makes us human. And this is where the power of God rests on us. And then the encouragement piece is just simply, I'm willing to go along with you. I'll come along beside you and I'll let you know my brokenness. I would love to hear yours. I'd love to listen. And then just simply dream of, God, what do you want to do? What if our greatest calling could be in our greatest area of pain? And I love to allow people, myself included, to begin to dream the dreams of God in their greatest points of pain. And all of a sudden, an hour later, I'm like, wait, what do you do? Where do you live? Like, all we've talked about is your brokenness. And yet it's just so profound. There is something so beautiful in connecting through story.
Yeah, when I was a pastor and we taught like evangelism seminars, we would emphasize the power of story because it's something you really can't argue with. You know, if someone starts spouting out stats, it's like, well, where'd you get those stats? Or I'm sure that's, you know, those have been skewed because of this or that, or even science anymore. You know, obviously we've seen in our culture, people argue with science and was it legit or was it, you know, did it have an agenda behind it? But when you just shared, this is what happened in my life, this is what I experienced, like no one's gonna go, well, that's not true. That's not what you experienced. Like if we have any level of credibility with a person, they feel like, wow, that's really incredible that happened to you. And I think in a very, you know, in a society that's become just incredibly relativist, like, well, whatever you believe is your belief.
Totally.
Our belief about our story actually really speaks to someone. And I think there's something intuitive about another person's story. We're naturally, because God wired us for a relationship, we're naturally looking for connection in someone's story. So if you use stats or science or even scripture to be like, well, this is wrong and here's why you should change, it's like, okay, great. But if you tell your story, I think the other person's brain is looking for those points to go, oh, I know what you've been through. I've experienced some of that. And so I think it's just really powerful to create connection in a time where some of those truths that we've all camped on, especially in our faith for a long, long time, don't always mean as much to another person. So whether we're sharing our story with someone that has a similar one and creating connection, or trying to share our story with family or friends or people that this is kind of a new step of vulnerability for us, that story is powerful and will create, I think, more engagement and curiosity than if we just tell people the stats and the latest, you know, story we heard in the media about, you know, someone using porn or sex trafficking or whatever. You know, there's a lot of sensational stuff happening. We can talk about that, but it won't necessarily create the curiosity for people to want to engage and go deeper with us.
I've heard it said too that that our brains are created to process information through a story framework. And I think that it's really easy to see that a large portion of Scripture is narrative, story, and that's how God chooses to communicate through His written word. But then also, it's what Jesus used most. You know, at least in His primary teachings, we see are parables. And so, yeah, it's not the personal story of Jesus, but it is telling through the lens of story. And I think that, and I've actually heard an author say this, that if you tell a story or a narrative, what people might reject, this may be more to what you were saying, what people might reject if you were just to present it as a principle up front, if you tell your story, it sneaks in past their defenses and then is able to expand, and they're able to maybe palate that a little bit better and a little cleaner. So there's a lot even to the neuroscience of story that just, it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it lights up both part of our brains because it's word and it's, you know, creativity. And so our right and left brain are listening versus you just go into stats and data, you get their left brain, but you got to
it's like
engage
this classroom
story.
again. Like I'm starting to wind down here. Yeah.
So John, I know that as you share your story, or as you coach other people to share stories, like at our annual fundraising dinner, that you're often following a three phase or a 3-category approach. So let's talk about that a little bit. The first phase of that is to explore what life was like before you encountered healing through Jesus and resources like Pure Desire. So what kind of questions help guide telling that part of our story? What do we need to know about telling the before side of our story?
Totally. Yeah, there's a handful of questions that I might ask somebody, but I think some of my top 3. The first one just being, what was your family of origin like, specifically in the lens of sexuality? Did you grow up in a family that talked openly about sexuality? And if you did, can I meet you? Because there's not a whole lot of us.
Yeah, seriously.
That wasn't my family of origin context. And so I think the implicit messages, whether that was communicated non-verbally, verbally, what was stated from the church and our family of origin, really sets the stage for what's about to happen. My second question that I love to ask is simply, when were you exposed to porn, or when did sexual brokenness enter your story? Because it's not always exposure to porn, whether that's abuse or harassment or molestation. There's a lot of different ways in which sexual brokenness can enter the narrative. But something even in the real world, if I can take it there for a second, something that I've found, asking somebody, when were you exposed to porn, really kind of beats them to the punch, and I think lessens the shame, because I'm assuming already that you've probably been exposed, and even just owning, like, I was exposed to porn at this age, that then set a trajectory of. And so I've actually found that question to be really helpful even outside of the walls of Pure Desire or story work. And then my third question that I love to ask is simply, how/when did the truth about sexual brokenness come out? And so for some of them, it was in an interview. That's my story, regarding, hey, I'd love to work as a campus missionary for Cru, And they're like, hey, hold on. What about this? Because you're talking a lot about sexual brokenness and addiction to porn, but we don't know if you're fully healed. But for a lot of people, it's in marriage. It's the spouse who found what I was looking at, whether that's browser history, it was a spouse that found an email. It was so many different ways. And so I think that moment is really what leads you into the second portion. But that moment seems to be kind of the fulcrum. So yeah, family of origin, that's number one. Number two is, when was exposure or sexual brokenness introduced? And then when was it revealed? When did it come out? Yeah.
You and I have spent a lot of time talking about, we use a specific framework called the Story Brand framework. And what you do is you have a character, and the first thing that you talk about in any story is the problem. And so you're identifying the problem, because every good story has a problem. I mean, and this is, I'm going to try not to nerd out too much, but like, I'm very much into movies and storytelling and screenwriting and all that if you just have a character who there's no problems the entire story, it's not a story. And no one's going to watch that movie. No one's going to read that book. It's just like, give me something,
Totally.
And so it's that idea of challenge or struggle, that what it does is it creates that new arc of, is this person really going to address this? Is this person really going to become who we think they can be or who they want to be? And so I think that this aspect of this 3-part kind of framework is really just establishing, like, my life wasn't perfect. Here's where the problem was. And to your point, it's just pointing a finger to, and now let's talk about what the solution is to that problem.
Well, and at Pure Desire, we use the phrase a lot, a cohesive narrative, telling a cohesive narrative. And so it's really looking at, in those before parts of our story, what are the pieces that connect the dots to everything else? I think sometimes when I hear people tell their story, they feel this need to like give us everything. Like, well, I was born in such and such place. And you're like, whoa, okay.
Does it make you think of The Jerk, by the way? I was born a poor black child. Something like that?
I guess if someone started that way. But
all right.
no, you feel like they're trying to give you the whole picture. And it's like, okay, if you write your own book someday, give us all that. But if you're telling your story, you maybe have, 10 minutes on an airplane, or you've got 5 minutes in front of your church, or, maybe you're with a friend and you've got half an hour, but in general, you don't get to tell everything. So really look at what was the problem that connects to the solution in the story, and emphasize kind of telling more about those parts. And I would say, without being careful not to glorify the past, because I think that's a huge kind of dilemma I see in Christianity a lot, that it's a little bit of the car accident effect. Like, this is ugly and I don't want to look, but I can't look away. And people will spend 80% of their time talking about their sin and all the stuff they did. And that might be intriguing, but it's kind of like, that's really not the point. And if we spend 80% of our time there, we've actually missed the point of stories. So like you were saying, John, yes, we want to create connection points. We want to be honest and truthful without being graphic or gory. But we want to make sure we're not glorifying sin. We're setting the stage for the real parts of the story. So I try to tell people, like, try to set the stage quickly, because at the end of the day, I don't need to know the breadth and depth and intricacies of your struggle. What I would like to know a whole lot about is, how did you encounter change? What did it look like? And that's what we're about to talk about. So,
well, and that balance too between, because I've heard people tell stories where it's like, well, I was struggling and it was hard, but God met me. And it's like, well, what were you struggling with?
Yeah, it's
like,
so vague.
Help me, please. Yeah. Like, was it alcohol? Was it gambling? Was it, whatever it may be. And so I think that being honest, but to your point, not like embellishing too much onto that. So that finding that balance, I think, is important in this first part.
When what I think is so cool about the first portion, this before, is it really, I think, invites the curiosity and compassion to hold, hey, where did you come from and how did that inform your story? And if we can begin to understand what informed it, we can also begin to start dreaming how to go back, to rewrite, to shift the lies or the set beliefs that weren't of God, and say, no, that wasn't true. And we get to go backwards to go forwards. That to me is so beautiful.
Well, and for all of us that have been through a Pure Desire group, we've understood the way that past pain, trauma, experiences created the avenue for struggle. And I think if we can tell that part of our story, that's actually very intriguing for people outside of a group, because it's like, wow, I thought it was just, porn is porn.
Yep.
But like when I tell my story, I'll emphasize growing up in a home with 3 siblings that were all close in age, and feeling that need to like get attention and stand out is where a lot of my performance needs came from. And finding that if I didn't perform well and I felt bad about myself in lust, fantasy, and eventually pornography, I always felt good. I always, was the perfect performer, so to speak. And linking that in my story, I think makes people kind of start to connect dots and go, oh, so it's not, it's not just a guy thing. It's not just something that because we got all these hormones. Like, there's actually connection points. Then I think you've got them stirred up thinking, well, what might my story be? How does my story connect? And that's, I think, pretty cool. And you see light bulbs go on even as you tell your story.
So good.
And that leads into the second part. And again, to that idea, you're creating that curiosity. And so the second category is sharing how Jesus' message of hope, freedom, and healing transformed you. So what are some ways that you've seen work or that you would suggest people share this part of their story?
Totally. And I'd just maybe couch it with the word compassion. I was on a phone call with a donor, and I kid you not, it was an hour and a half. At one point, I just considered putting myself on mute. I'm like, you don't need me to have this conversation. But an hour and a half later, he shared 3 words that have radically changed the way I think about this journey of becoming like Jesus in the way of our sexuality. And the 3 words were curiosity, compassion, and courage. And I think those 3 words actually overlay really, really well. Can you be curious about the before? Can you be compassionate for the during as you're working this out? And then can you be courageous to go and partner with what Jesus is calling you to do? But regarding compassion, this ability to co-suffer, whether that's with yourself or with others, my first question might catch maybe our audience off guard a little bit. It's simply, how did you hear about Pure Desire? Because it's not everybody and their dog that's walking around, talking about the 7 pillars and betrayal and beyond, or hey, like it was on the bulletin. Now, there are churches and places like that, but for a lot of people, it was, I heard from a friend. It was, we were in crisis. I know we've used the analogy of our building before, and the front door quite literally is crisis. The amount of people who are calling in the moment of pain, and they've Google searched, I need Christian help regarding sexual addiction. And so then they land on our doorstep. And I think inviting people to go back to think, oh yeah, like it was actually in pain or crisis, again, that moment of discovery that I then began the journey. Where did you begin is really important. And what was that first step? Because if you can understand your first step, you can then give that potentially away to others. So that's number 1. Number 2 is just, were there specific mile markers on your journey? I'd love to share a story. So I jumped into counseling in 2020, and shout out to Jason Carstens. He's one of our Pure Desire clinicians. He's incredible. And I'm sitting in an office called the Hope Center in Plano, Texas, while working for Josh McDowell Ministry, which is underneath Crew. And he looks at me and says, do you believe objective truth? And I'm like, Jason, I work for Josh McDowell. He's literally an apologist. He staked his whole life on objective truth, that the Bible and the Word of God is his words. And I said, I think if I say no, he materializes out of the wall and slaps me.
Josh McDowell?
Yeah. I don't know what's going to happen if I say no.
Yeah.
And so of course I say yes. And then Jason Carstens, in a moment that I'll never forget, looked me in the eyes and says, no, you don't. He said, no, you don't. Not in the moment of temptation, you don't. He said, because in the moment of temptation, you bow to your feelings and you worship them as if they were God. And I had this kind of almost out-of-body experience, like Dr. Strange, when he gets knocked out of his metaphysical body. He's
Great movie
floating,
reference.
He's floating behind him. And I'm like, who is this guy? He's a hypocrite. And then that, reality crashes and boom, that's me. And that's a moment in my story that I'll never forget. When I saw the duplicity so clearly of I'm saying one thing, but I'm doing another. And my actions are indicating what I really believe, because we act upon what we believe. So again, the second question is, are there mile markers in your story? Moments that you look back and say, something changed, something happened. And then the third question in this category that I think is really important is, what did that feel like? What was your experience? Again, how specific can you be? I think specificity, however you say that word, authenticity.
Specificity.
It's hard. That's a hard word.
And authenticity are really important in the journey, because if we're broad and generic and say, I fell, I tripped, I stumbled, what does that even mean?
Now I'm doing better.
Yeah.
And now I'm doing better.
Yeah,
Let's name it. And again, not to glorify it,
Yeah.
but that others might say, hey, me too. That's a powerful moment.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about those mile markers, or those kind of trademark moments, or I call them a lot like the aha moments. It's asking of ourselves the question, where did I start to turn the corner? Where did I start to change? Because I think for so many of us, we have experienced the roller coaster or the wheel of just round and round the same thing, binge, purge, repeat, binge, purge, repeat. And that's, I think, common for people that have struggles, whether it's, again, porn or gambling or food or workaholism. We do better for a while, things get rough, we're back where we started, we try harder. And so to have someone express this is where I began to break free. This is where God revealed something to me that I hadn't seen before, or in a way I hadn't understood. and things really began to change. What I think we might underscore is how significant that is to people that might still be stuck in some kind of roller coaster or binge purge cycle, because when you're in it, there is a part of you that really believes this is the time. Like, this is the time. I'm going to try hard enough. The stars will align. I'll be free. But if they're honest with themselves, they're like, well, but I haven't really changed yet. What's going to make a difference? And then they hear your story and it's like, oh, that's different. I've not heard that before. I don't really think I've heard someone going down that road. And so when you can share those pieces, even if it's not necessarily going to be what they experience, I think it does create a vision of hope, of a future that can be different. And it's not just that someone tried hard enough that, gosh darn it, they finally made it. I'm proud of them.
Absolutely.
It's like, no, you encountered God in a new way. You experienced his love and grace and strength, and were able to apply it in your life in ways that actually are creating some effective growth and change. That's what needs to be glorified. That's what needs to be brought out, because it's not common. And when it does happen, I would hope that any one of us would hear something like that and realize, well, that's a reason to celebrate.
Yeah.
Like, man, look what God did in this life. Look what God did in my life. And then having a person believe, and that's what he can do in my life too.
Yeah, and I think with this too, specifically if you're talking to people who are Christians, which, a lot of us grow up in a context, a culture where it's information equals transformation. If you just read your Bible, you'll become more like Jesus. And I think it's important in this aspect to share not just truths that are legit, but also experiences that reinforced it. I mean, for me, I remember the first time I shared my full disclosure, shared that one thing I was never going to share, that same-sex experience I had when I was, a young guy. And I remember the experience I had when two guys turned to me and said, "Me too." And I remember the shame like dripping off of me, completely falling off of me. And that, to Nick, what you said at the top of the episode, like, no one can argue that experience with me. No one can argue what I felt or what I experienced in that moment. But also that reinforces both sides of our brain, that it's not just, I know this is true. It's, I know this is true and I experienced something on a horizontal level in relationship with God's people that reinforce that reality. So I think that's an important piece in this, is making sure that sharing experiences, things that actually happened to us, in us, around us, is shared.
Yeah, praise God for that moment.
Yeah.
So we talked about the before and being able to articulate that, explaining the experience we're having, or the during, the turning point, the mile markers. Now let's talk about the after. So in the final category of describing what life is like after experiencing healing from brokenness or betrayal trauma, what are some of the guidelines for fleshing out this part of our story?
This is by far my favorite part, because our stories of vulnerability at the beginning, of naming it specifically, really do dispel shame and begin to cast this vision of hope, hope that something could really change. This is the moment where that gets so cemented and now I have this set hope. And so as I began in my role, getting to call donors, I remember a mentor had said, "John, just ask them, what's the story? What's the story?" Now, he was thinking behind the gift, but as I began to ask that question, of course, the answers weren't necessarily about generosity. The answers were about what God had done. I was here, this is what happened, and this is where I'm at now. And I had a mentor say, "John, you must ask every single donor, who were you before and who were you after?" Because movements, and again, I think Pure Desire is much more of a movement of healing, not just a ministry in a building, but a movement that is not just the U.S., but the nations. Movements change things. And Jesus, the person of Jesus, walks into a room and calls people by their name, and things begin to change. And so the question of who were you before and who are you after? I literally just recently had somebody on a Zoom call say, "John, my world was black and white before, and now everything is in vivid color." Like, I didn't know what living really was. I didn't know I didn't know how to feel. I didn't know how to name emotions. And now I know what I'm feeling, and I know how to name emotions. I'm having hard and honest conversations with my wife, and we're not perfect because it's not a destination, but we are in the direction of change. And I'm going, can we just get that story on blast? That's incredible. And I think we probably, if we're being honest, had similar experiences. I remember reading Unwanted in my recovery journey by Jay Stringer, and he's talking about sensuality. And of course, that had been kind of like a bad word, growing up in my Christian context. Yes. And it was here where I'm going, man, like, I can light a candle and enjoy the smell. Like that before, I was like, that's kind of weird. But in the process and afterwards, I'm going, no, like, God's given me senses. And as a single who's pursuing celibacy and not necessarily this ton of sexuality in my life in that regards. Like, there are other ways in which I can engage the senses that God has given me by enjoying a walk, feeling the rain, seeing the trees, smelling the world that God has created. And so that's question number one. Who are you before and who are you now becoming? And then number two is just simply, what are you passionate about and what has God called you to? Because the reality is we enter into rooms with strengths and weaknesses. And again, I would just dare anybody to believe that our weaknesses are really where God wants to do his best work. And so it's often in these places of pain, whether that's identifying them in Pillar 3, Lesson 1, your top 10 pain moments, or just throughout the process and saying, God, what if you could do something with this? God, could you redeem this? And if you could redeem this, then I would tell that story the rest of my life in the same way that the woman at the well finds out that Jesus knows she has all these other husbands. Like, oh my gosh, what should have been a moment of shame becomes a moment of being known and seen and loved. And what does she do? She goes back. And the lady who has all this pain now becomes the storyteller.
Yeah.
Did you hear? I met the man who knew everything. And she starts telling everybody this passion is birthed out of knowing and meeting the person of Jesus in her great pain. So yeah, what are you passionate about and what has God called you to?
I just want to be clear when John says he's pursuing celibacy that he doesn't mean lifelong. So gals that are out there, don't hold back.
Please.
It's just a temporary condition.
Justin put his number in the show notes.
Help you out with that, John.
Please. That is good. Okay, so I think in just a couple of things to add to that, I feel like one of the things we can do is almost like breeze through this part where it's like we're almost minimizing it, where it's like, and God saved me and it's great and my life's awesome. It's like, you got to be specific on what the problem was. You got to be specific about what helped you. And then you got to be specific about what it looks like now. But I feel like even more important than that, and man, this is something me and my wife really try to do. The community we're around tries to do, but it's difficult at times because we live in a world that glorifies being shiny and looking good and, having everything seem presentable, but to not tie everything in a bow. It's like, oh, my marriage is just, we're crushing it now. And financially we're great. And parenting, easy, no, to not any of those things, to still say that even though God has healed me in this area and I have hope, I have freedom, I have healing in this area, that doesn't mean that there aren't other parts of brokenness in my life.
I've got to say this. As we were going through the PSAP training, Marnie Faree, and if you guys haven't heard of her, please look her up. She's incredible. I know you guys are very familiar with her. And she has an incredible story of addiction, of betrayal, and everything in between. And during the training, she shared her story for an hour and a half. And now this was a good hour and a half. I was very attuned and very aware of what was going on.
Yeah.
And she got to the end, and we were just blown away. The 50 people on this Zoom call, and we're all muted, but we're clapping and we're raising our hands, and we're all celebrating what God has done. And after the applause had kind of died, she unmuted and she said something I'll never forget. Again, another mile marker in my story. She said, I have been healed in so many ways, and I am healing. And that is our story. I need you to know what God has done. And I also need you to know that I'm still trusting him to do so much more. And I don't think it's because we're so broken. I think it's because he's so good that he can't stop coming after our brokenness. And yes, we are broken, but yes, he is so good. And he wants to write stories of redemption in our lives. And so, yes, I've been healed. And yes, I am still in the process of healing.
Yeah, we've all been a little poisoned by, American storytelling and the classic, and they all lived happily ever after. Right? Because if you see a movie, typically it's crisis resolution credits.
Yeah.
And there's always this part of me that's like, I'd like to see, crisis resolution and then what happens. Like, what does life look like? Because that is the reality of our journey, that we are still humans. We are still living in a fallen world. And being a human being is complex. It can be messy. It can be challenging. And so I think to process with people how my story of change is being lived out, even imperfectly, can encourage them like, oh, I could get there too, because we talk about this a lot, that it's not that arrival mindset. It's the mentality of you're on a journey, we're growing, we're in process. So maintaining that posture of humility, of vulnerability, of growth, of change. And what I don't think we realize is that is a lot more endearing to people than we know. There's a part of us that maybe feels like, well, I had the bad story, I got over it, now I'm all better. And in some ways, that's just reverting back to our performance way of thinking, or that I find my value in being good enough, that if now everything's bright and shiny, I'm all better. It's like, no, actually, when I can say, I still really can wrestle from time to times with finding my value in how well I perform, or my paycheck, or my job title, or if I'm a good parent. So when my kids act up, I start to shame myself. And then I think people can kind of take a deep breath and go like, oh, okay, this is real, but the change is still real. Like I'm still pursuing the change in a good way amidst a life that can be very difficult in a lot of ways. So I think talking about those two things, John, like what does life look like now? And so much that vision piece of like, what am I passionate about? What do I think God's called me to? What, in group a lot, we talk about the legacy that we want to leave behind and how important that is, because it does become kind of that new, North Star, that standard. This is where I'm headed. This is where my journey is taking me. And along the way, there's speed bumps and roadblocks and difficulties, but I now know where I'm headed, where maybe before all I knew was how to take care of myself. Now it's like I've got a bigger vision of my life and I'm captured by it. And I think that kind of propels someone along with us too. Like, I want something like that too. And theirs might be different than ours, but that sense of I was made for a purpose, I think is on all of our hearts. So sharing that is just so, so important.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Nick, as you were saying that, I had a friend recently tell me, I'd still look at porn if I could. Like, he was just honest. He was like, it's tempting. I still want to do it, still being able to be raw, and not in a sense of glorifying it by any means, but still just saying.
Well, it sounds like acknowledging, there's a ton of dopamine there. Dopamine feels good.
Yeah, and I don't feel good right now. So, okay, and I love this question, John, mostly because you and I have had this conversation so many times. And the question is, like, what if we feel like we've already told our story, or maybe even like we've told it a lot and we're starting to feel kind of that hangover? Can we tell our story too much or too often?
Yeah, my first thought is no. And I want to give a caveat to that. I would just say, how can we not share the story that God is writing? Now, I think there are ways in which we can share it that would be inappropriate, oversharing, that might be too much. I mean, just to let you guys into a little bit of my own journey, a part of that was I used to tell people, they'd say like, wait, you're living in Oregon. Like, how did you get here? And I would say, it's a long story, one word, God. And I would totally bait and switch them. I didn't really know I was doing it, but I was. Tell me your story. And then it's just like, I was addicted to porn and Jesus saved me and now I'm doing this. And I just wanted so desperately to be known and seen, a good desire, but it was coming out in a bad way. And now it's, I work for a nonprofit. And giving them the dignity of choice to say, what's the nonprofit? And then I say, Pure Desire. And they say, again, giving them the dignity of choice. What does Pure Desire do? And then talking about how we help people break free from unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. And they're like, whoa, that's deep. And I'm like, yeah, it is.
It is.
And it's a piece of my story. Yeah. And I might simply say, I struggled with porn addiction in high school, and I found a lot of healing through Jesus and through relationship with others. And Pure Desire was a big part of that story. And so I think I don't think you can share your story too much, because I really hope it's God's glory in and through your life. And I hope his name is praised every single time you say it, and that people truly see the power at hand, that he is a God who takes ashes and makes beauty, that he takes dry bones and makes armies, that he takes addicts and makes those who've healed and recovered are in that process and can do the same for others. And so I don't think there is, but there can be some unhealthy ways that we might lean towards oversharing, or simply being, don't ask that guy, or don't talk to that guy. So let's do it in appropriate ways.
Well, and in the book of Revelation, it says they overcame them by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And so if the word of our testimony and what Christ has done in our life is that powerful, it would make total sense that the enemy of our souls wants to quash that, wants to take away the desire to share that, to give us kind of a been there, done that feeling about it. And, I know that I can feel that way sometimes. I've shared my story in a lot of ways and places, and it's like, well, I'm sure everybody's heard my story and it's kind of old news to me and I'm tired of sharing it. I mean, because honestly, you can get that way, like when you speak, like, this is what I always talk about. But I know there are ways and places that God has reminded me, like, for a lot of people in the room, wherever I'm at, most of them haven't heard my story. Yeah. Even those that have don't remember it near to the degree that I think they do. And there's always a kind of an aspect or a dynamic that I think is different when I tell it. So it's trying to be aware of, like, what's my environment? Who am I telling it to? Is it one-on-one? Is it in a large group? And what about this environment might be more conducive to, focusing more on family of origin, or focusing more on, kind of how sports played into my story, or focusing more on, my dynamics with the church and being in leadership. Like wherever you're at, I think you learn, the more you tell your story, the more you kind of learn you can morph it a little bit, still telling all a true story, but highlighting other parts more than others, because you just have a sense this is what's going to connect with this audience. And something too, I felt like God told me early on about, this part of my life, sharing your story, is that he said, if you'll be faithful to tell your story, I will be faithful to use it. And I think there's a sense that's true for all of us, that our job is to tell the story. And if the whole room doesn't, stand up and applaud or fall on their knees in repentance, like we're not there to manage the response. That's God's work. That's the Spirit in people's hearts. But if we can be faithful, whether the environment is small, one-on-one, or we get to stand on a stage, like, Lord, I'm going to authentically and vulnerably share my story, and I pray that you would impact hearts and lives. And then that can take off of us some of the pressure to feel like, well, I don't know if my story's powerful enough. I don't think I'll share it. It's like, well, that's not really your job. Just share your story. So I think when the door is there, walk through it in appropriate ways, in an appropriate time frame. If you're one-on-one with someone on an airplane, maybe don't give them the 2-hour version if they didn't really ask for that. Maybe start with the 2-minute version and let them ask questions.
Keep referencing airplanes because I share my story on airplanes.
John is very good at that. I am not. I would be much more likely to do it in other environments.
Totally.
But I'm just saying, kind of read the room is a phrase we've used.
Yeah.
And if you have the opportunity to share longer and deeper, it's with a friend, it's someone that has asked, man, help me understand how this is even possible. Like, could I tell you my story? Versus, meeting a stranger at Starbucks and you got a minute. So that's, I think, the beauty too of what we've talked about, the before, during, and after. If you've got a clear idea of the main idea of those 3 sections, I think you can tell your story in a minute or an hour, because you've got your anchors, and you could just share your anchors in a minute and bam, 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 this is what God did, or you can tell all the backstory. So it's, I think, really useful to have that in mind.
Yeah. Nick, you made me think of something. This last weekend, I was at the Global Leadership Summit, and Dallas Jenkins, who's the director of the TV show The Chosen, used the analogy that it's not our job to feed the 5,000, it's our job to bring the loaves and fishes. I thought that was just an amazing, amazing illustration and obviously a visual from Scripture. I think for me, and this is something, and I alluded to it at the beginning of the question, and I think I'm having even a little bit of self-discovery right now. Like on this podcast, I share so much of my life. And when people listen to stuff, I'm not telling stories from what happened like years ago. Most of the time I'm telling you stuff that's happened in the last week of my life. And so I feel like I have this vulnerability hangover sometimes where I walk out and someone wants to know information. I'm like, but I'm just so tired right now. I just don't want to share.
Listen to episode 219.
Yeah, right. Well,
I just shared it.
There is a reality to that where it's like, oh, just go listen to this, or just go listen to that. But I think that there is that element too of trusting that in that moment, the Lord might want to use, even when you're really tired and you're tired of telling the same story again, use it in a new and fresh way. And I got to do better at that, I think.
Two thoughts. First, I just want to say thank you to both of you for sharing your authentic stories on a week in and week out basis, like you're talking about. Like when I get to connect with donors, and man, what a privilege and an honor to do so and to hear the stories that God is writing. So many of them say, I feel like I know Nick and Trevor. And so just as a kudos to you guys of like, this is a place where you guys are being real and honest. And then Nick, to your point of, if you'll be faithful to share it, I'll be faithful to use it. I was just reminded last year getting to fly to North Dakota and to get to speak and kind of use my story in a new context in a small town church. And it was supposed to be just for youth group, just for the youth kids. But they were like, man, we should make this a whole church-wide event. I had shared a snippet of my story, and they're like, is that what you're sharing tonight? And they're like, we're inviting everybody. And they invited everybody. I'm like, my audience just changed drastically. Here we go. And yet I got to share it maybe in front of 30, 40 people. Wasn't a ton. The weekend came and went. I was flying out of this small town in North Dakota, and there was one guy in the airport. And of course, you guys know me. I walk in, I'm like, yes, he's mine. Like I get 20, 30 minutes.
Captive audience.
I get a captive audience. Here we go.
No idea.
And I walk up, and I'm like, hey, my name's John. And he goes, oh, I know. I'm like, whoa, what? And he goes, I was there Friday night, and I heard your story. And I went home, and I told my wife of 36 years something I had never told her. And I'm like now like crying in this airport. Like, what? Like, God, are you serious? And he goes, it was really painful. He goes, but I think there's a lot of hope on the other side.
That's cool.
And I just walked away going, man, God, like, you're so insanely incredible at doing things that I can't ask, think, or imagine. And so just as an encouragement to the audience, like, we never know.
Yeah.
We never know who's in the crowd, and we never know what God's doing.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So for a lot of people, telling their story is fearful, intimidating, and I hope today we've given them a lot of courage and ideas and like that sense of, you can do this, don't overcomplicate it. But for people on the other end of the spectrum, there is a little bit of a like, any opportunity, like, here I go. So what kind of guidance would you give them on how might we know if the situation is right? Like, how do we read the room and get a sense for, is this an open door to share my story? What kind of guidance would you give there?
Yeah, I think safety is really important. And I think what we experience within a group context, whether that's Betrayal and Beyond, Unraveled, 7 Pillars, Living Free, is that sense of confidentiality, the memo of understanding. We all have kind of a baseline. And of course, you're not going to get that in the real world. And so I don't know what categories or how you would maybe define safety, but let's define if this person is safe. I find myself sharing my story most often in a one-on-one context over coffee. After usually I'll say something about pure desire, and the other young adult that's looking me in the eyes is like, can we have coffee? I'm like, yeah, that'd be awesome.
Sure,
Let's do it. And then we share stories in this safe place. And so, yeah, assess the safety. I don't think it's always necessarily the right place. And then secondly, this is going to be maybe a little bit of a left turn, but I just want people to know that we're talking about your story of healing. This isn't the fullness of your story. This is just a portion of it. There is so much to what God is doing. And so please don't limit yourself to think, I'm just a story of sexual brokenness, and it's just about my, like, what about financial, and what about like career? And there's so many other stories that God is weaving in our lives. And so please don't feel boxed of like, I guess I just have to share my sexual brokenness or betrayal trauma with everybody. No, that's not always true. So yeah, I think I'd assess the safety of the person. It's really important to have an attuned listener. And I think the beauty of having somebody who is safe, who is attuned, who enters into our story, they can often play the role of new eyes and new perspective. And actually, our stories are being shaped as we share them, which is why it's so important, because we are all in progress. And as we share it, somebody goes, wait, you said this, or Ted's famous line, hey, can you unpack that for me? And I think that's the really beautiful part about sharing our story with safe people. That in the same way that we can't smell the smell of our homes, we're inviting somebody who isn't nose blind into our story. Hey, I smelled this, and that's not normal. And you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea because I've lived in that story. And so I think it's really important to invite outside people into the story, but yeah, to make sure that they're safe. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts around safety.
I just was thinking, you and I have had this conversation before about almost repurposing the 3 circles tool that we use for relapse prevention and doing it in a way where it's, you have your inner circle of people that know everything. You have a middle circle of people that know most of your story, and then an outer circle that you're not safe with those people. You don't necessarily need to. And I think you and I, when we've talked about it, that when we've lived in secrecy and shame, that there's this easy, what tends to happen when you get into recovery and healing is it feels like this like hard shift to the other direction. Like, everyone get in my kitchen, everyone's in the inner circle. And I think that can do damage to yourself. I think it can do damage to the people you're talking to. And so I think, I think the one thing you need to consider is just time. Like, who deserves to be in that inner circle, and who deserves to hear your whole story, and boundaries, and don't just consider your safety, but also, is this person ready to hear this part of my story?
So true.
Yeah, I think it's good to test the waters, so to speak. I find myself a lot when people ask, what do you do? Say I work at Pure Desire, I direct a nonprofit. And if they follow up with like, oh, that's interesting, how'd you get involved there? I'll say, I had to walk out of my own addiction, and my wife and I found incredible healing through Pure Desire. And if that sparks curiosity and they ask more, it's like, oh, okay, this is the open door. Or sometimes it's like, oh, hard left turn, change the subject.
Thank you. And they
How
turn
about them
away.
Cubs?
Yeah, right.
It's like, okay, not the right time or place. And so wherever you're at, unless someone has invited you to jump into the deep end, don't just jump into the deep end. Maybe start with a few things. And if it's sparking questions, curiosity, like, okay, I can wade in deeper. The other thing that I'm always just trying to think of in those situations is, if I'm not sure, just ask. Like, say, I've had quite a story of healing from addiction in my own life. Would it be okay if I shared that?
That's good.
And giving them that dignity to say, I'd love to another time, but can't really right now. Or, it's rare, I think, for someone to turn that down. But even in asking, you're giving them kind of that opportunity to say no. And even if in politeness they say yes, it's like, well, I said yes, so okay, they're going to listen. They're going to be impacted by it.
Right.
But yeah, if you're not sure, just ask. And I think their response will really give you clarity on how much to share, and really create that opportunity in those circumstances.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up then. When you think about someone who's trying to, and obviously it could be an hour, it could be over weeks and years, or it could just be a 3-minute conversation in a coffee line, what final encouragements would we give people in using this 3-piece kind of framework to tell our stories effectively?
Yeah, I'd say the simpler the better to start. Like we're talking about, there is that center circle, that all in that 4 secrets, top 10 pain, matrix of addiction, you go down the list. And that's not for everybody, but I'd just say keep it really simple. There was a before, and that could be as simple as I struggled with pornography in high school. I then came in contact with Pure Desire and began to realize that porn wasn't my problem. It was just a poor solution to the pain, and I began to walk in greater lengths of freedom and healing. And then the after is I felt called to share my story of sexual brokenness so that the next generation might know Jesus and not addiction. That's my story.
That's 15 seconds.
That was 15 seconds.
Right.
So where's the 15-second version? Again, I think sometimes when someone says, what's your story? It can feel overwhelming. There can be a lot of anxiety. What are they asking? How long do I have to talk?
What do you want from me?
Yeah, what do you want?
That's how,
And it's
for
just
sure.
like, what if it was just as simple as, again, a before, during, after. And so whether that's through the lens of curiosity, like, hey, can you be curious of and honest of what was before, compassionate to care enough for what was in the between, and now courageous enough to share that story. And I think just one last maybe question that I think is really helpful, instead of approaching it with what was wrong with me, what happened to me? That is such a pivotal question, from judgment to compassion. And so as somebody's saying, what's your story? Just, this is what's happened to me. This is where I've been. And this is where I'm at now. Please share the hope. Like, they need the hope. They need the hope.
Yeah, I love the idea that we need to write it down. We need to write it out. This can be a messy area, and sometimes we start sharing. It's just like, and this, I forgot about that. Well, I need to tell you this. And we're just all over the place. And that can actually make us fearful to share our story, because it's like, where do I start? It's just this jumble of all these thoughts, experiences. Well, writing your story kind of forces you to create some continuity, some flow, and then to look at it. And if you realize you've got 19 pages, well, there's probably 1 or 2 people on the planet that need to hear the 19-page version. It's then looking at, okay, how could I pare this down to a page or 2? How can I make it manageable? And after you've written it out, and I know this sounds funny, but like, practice it. Go to your group or your spouse or a close friend that knows most of the story and say, hey, I've written it up. Could I share with you? And does it make sense? Is it cohesive? And what I think is amazing when we start to do that, we will find all these times where coincidentally someone asked me about my story, or you'll never believe it, I had this chance to tell someone. It was just this huge coincidence. And it's like, well, was it? Or was it that now we were prepared? We felt confident. It was on our minds. And we saw an opportunity where before we would have been maybe too fearful and we would have just let it pass us by. But now there's all these coincidences where I get to share my story because I'm ready. So if you don't feel ready, but you've never really written it down or thought it through or practiced it, that's probably why. And if you just take some of those simple steps, like tonight, start working on your story, start writing it out. Or maybe you did it in group and haven't looked at it since you did it 6 months ago. Like, go back to that rough draft and start to refine, start to think about, what could I actually say if I was in a conversation with a friend who didn't know this story at all, and practice that. And then I believe God just has a way of opening those doors that you'll get to use it. So take that first step and see what happens.
Yeah. I got 2 things. One is, like, use current situations and language, like in context. Like, I think sometimes you hear leaders or you're listening to them, share or talk, and they're talking about all these things that happened in the past. It's like, yeah, I get that. You're awesome. But, like, do you struggle with stuff now? Can you, like, help me understand? So I think that that can go a long way, like when.
And then I met Jesus, and then I became Jesus. So I'm all good.
Yep. So
no,
when we get to heaven, I'll be in line first. But yeah, anyways, I think that's the first one, is using some of that current stuff. But then, I don't know if you guys have experienced, I'm sure you have experienced this. When someone's telling you their story and you can tell they want something from you, you can tell there's an agenda here or there's a hook on the end, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to shrink back over here. I think telling our stories without having an agenda, like just knowing that if someone asks or wants to know, I'm just sharing, and almost let that person guide where you go. If they have more questions, great. If they turn away and like, that guy's weird, he works for a porn ministry, great. That's fine, move on. But don't go into it with like, I am going to wield my story in a way that's going to change this person's life, and I'm not going to accept failure. It's like, well, who's that about then?
Yeah.
And so I think keeping that in mind.
Quick story. I was at the gym one time and a guy was, being friendly, making conversation, but then he asked, he got like, you could tell his demeanor change. He's like, how satisfied would you say you are with your life? And there was this little red warning light that went off because I'd actually sat through a sales presentation and that's what they taught. Like, so just ask people at the gym how satisfied. Then I'm like, and I just immediately, the kind of smarmy sales pitchy, I was just trying to like run away from this guy. I'm like, don't try to sell me your product because I'm really not
You're
interested.
running away. Super satisfied. Super satisfied.
Yeah, I was like, actually, I'm really, and I said, I'm really genuinely happy. I'm not looking for more. And you could tell like he wanted to go into his pitch, but I had an answer. And I think when we are super excited about Pure Desire or a story like this, to remember, as you've been saying, John, for some people, it's a foreign smell. It's still like there's maybe a ton of fear in their life. This is a huge pocket of shame. They're maybe around people that have no idea you might not even know what they're struggling with. And so if you get hesitation, fearfulness, it's okay. Like, don't be sales pitchy. Just like you've said, John, be compassionate, be gracious, be kind, and be patient that may not be the moment that you could still share your story, knowing that if the reaction you get is kind of like, oh, wow, thanks, good. Yeah. And they walk away like, oh, well, that didn't, I thought it was going to create some great response. Well, maybe they're processing some things at a level way deeper than you realize. So
Nick,
just share the story, but don't be a sales pitch is I guess why I brought that up.
Yeah, literally last year, and we can close here. Last year, I was sharing with two dudes over some pizza. We had recently met. We were newer to the city, and I shared my story pretty openly and pretty vulnerably. And me and my roommate got in the car, and my roommate was like, what was that? We were getting to know one another. And I'm like, dude, those guys were so closed off, and they didn't share at all. Like, I just have such a high expectation. And again, sometimes I have to remember the world in which I live in regarding work isn't necessarily the world that other people are living in.
Yeah, right.
And honestly, in some ways, it was really prideful and really arrogant on my end because I was expecting them to be so open and so honest. And it was a year later that reality really crashed for me. And like, honestly, just got emotional. You're sharing, Nick, because this guy and I, one of those guys that was sitting there not being open, gets in a car. We get in a car together, go to lunch after church. And he looks at me, he goes, gosh. He goes, John, I've been running from you for a long time. I'm like, what? And he goes, we have the exact same story. And he goes, and a year ago when you shared it, it was so frustrating because the amount of hope that you found, the amount of stuff that you have. And he just had sat there comparing himself the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, I need exactly what you have and I don't know how to get it. And it was just like this really like whoa moment of like, man, God, forgive me for the times I haven't been gracious. Forgive me for the times where I haven't shown mercy. Forgive me for the times I've been so arrogant and prideful to think that the world should go exactly how I want it to go. And so he's now in a group, and it's like really cool to watch what God is doing in his life.
So cool.
So this framework is super simple, and we know that it's effective, clearly, with your job, and we know that we know that this conversation is going to be helpful if you're thinking about how to tell your story, because this is something that's pretty customizable as well, but just using this before, during, and after approach. And John, we appreciate the hours you spend with people. We appreciate your time and helping us unpack this framework. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, so great.